we're going over what are variables, when to use them, root parent current specific page, variables inside grids, and when to use a cookie instead.
Yep.
Why y'all gotta use words like cookies, but okay.
Biscuits. She's biscuits. Yeah, so I've in DMs and in Discord, we've seen a lot of different questions about variables and scope in general. So we thought we'd do something fairly high level, just talking about kind of concepts. And I'll go into a project, and as usual, I just have a blank project. I'll create some pages and we'll see how those variables play together on the pages. And then I do want to talk about cookies in the same context, because depending on where you're trying to reuse a certain temporary value, you'll either use a variable or you'll use a cookie, depending on how you want to retrieve that, how long you want that thing to persist, things like that. So I just want to talk about conceptually the differences and when to use each one. So let me show my screen. And so I just got a blank project here. So let's make a couple of pages. Let's do a home page here. We'll just call it home. And I'll just drop a heading on here. And home page. And then let's make another page. Oops, over here. There we go. And we'll call this like, we'll just call it page 2. Just conceptual today. So heading, and this is page 2. So there's several ways that these pages can interact with each other. One way is they can both have routes. So you can have like a /home route and then a /page 2 route. And those routes will then go to that page. Another way is to open one page inside of another. Oh man. So like if I put a div on here on this one, and let's call this, let me move the zoom stuff out of the way. Let's call this div, page 2 container. And let's put a button above this page. And we'll call this open page 2 in container. And then we're going to do another button for open page 2 in route. Okay, so we're going to basically open the same exact page in 2 different ways. One inside of a container on the current page that I'm in, the home page, and another inside like in its own URL route. So if we go to preview the first time here, it's going to ask us what our root page is. I'll choose home and we'll open it. So now I've got just this little page with these 2 buttons. So back in here, let's make the open page 2 in container open up. So we'll go new flow, open page 2 container, use the open page action. And we're going to open page 2 into this div. So now back on here, if I click that button, it opens page 2 into that container on the current page. And on this one, let's make a quick event for open page 2 in route. And I need to go make a route for page 2 because I don't have one yet. So we're going to go over to URL page routes, make a new one, call it page 2, and select page 2 as both our unauthenticated and our authenticated page. So now we have this route here. So we have 2 routes, one for home, one for page 2. And let's open page again, but this time we're going to open page into browser tab window. So what I'm going to do is open into a new tab, the page 2 route. Okay. So if I go to here now, I can click open page 2 into a new route, and it's going to open that same page into a new URL route. So I've got these 2 different things going on here. Open page 2 into container and open page 2. So just conceptually, what I'm defining here is different ways of scoping a page. So like the page scope of page 2 inside of here is that it's inside of the home page. The page scope of page 2 as a URL route is that it's the root page, it's the top level page. Whereas over here, the home page is the root or top level page, and then we have other pages nested inside. And conceptually, that's important for understanding how the variables work, specifically some of the terminology when you're setting and retrieving variables, where you have current page, root page, parent page. Understanding that hierarchy of the structure of where these pages are opening in context to each other is really important in understanding how those variables operate together. So let's do a couple of other things. We're going to put a value on here that we're going to set a page variable, and then we're going to use that page variable in page 2. So you can see, like on the home page, I set a variable, and then on page 2, we'll use that variable for a purpose. So let's do that real quick. So I'm going to put an input on here, and we'll just put it here. It's fine. And this input, what I'm going to do is make this to where the input, you'll type a value into it, and that will set, and then we'll make a button that sets that value into a variable on the home page. So let's go a little further. Go to div here. I'm going to put the text input inside of a div just to organize this a little bit. And then we'll do another button here. This one is set variable. Misspelled that. There we go. And then let's go ahead and set the action on there. So we're going to do a new flow. We'll call it set variable. Doing a set variable action as well. Yeah. Oh, there. Missing it. So this is where we get into the context part, the scope part. So in code, when you have, like in JavaScript, when you have a variable that you're setting, there's a scope to that variable. And what it really means in terms of scope is what can access that variable and in what relationship can it access it. So for instance, right now I'm in this home page, and the home page on this URL route is the root page. It's the top level page. It's also the current page because it's the outer page. So if I were to set the target page for this variable to current, that would be exactly the same as setting it to root here, because the page I'm in is the root page. So the page I'm in is the current page and the root page. So in certain circumstances, current and root are actually interchangeable. And then also in this context, the home page, selecting that specific page, is also the same thing. In all three of those cases, I would be setting the variable in the exact same spot, and I can read it using any of those things. So for this purpose, I'm just going to do current page, but you could really do any of them. And let's just set a variable called my value. And obviously it would be named anything you want. Let's do that. And the value for that variable, I'm going to get from that input. So we're going to pull it out of that text input. So now we're going to set a variable in the current page called my value. And then we're going to use that value. We're going to set the value with whatever is typed into this field. So that way we can change it and see it happening. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to do is go to page 2, and we're going to use that value that we set in the variable, and we're going to set it into an element on this page. So let's put an element like a text box here, a paragraph element, and well, we'll just leave it text box. That's fine. And then I'm going to put a button on here, and the button is going to get the variable set into text. So we're just going to, on the button click, we're going to get the variable that was set over here, and we're going to set it into that text box. So I'll go to events on here, new flow. We'll just do get variable as the name. And on this one, we're going to set the value, not variable, value of an element. So what we're going to do is set the value of this text box, this text paragraph element, and the value we're going to set into it is from a variable, right? So now in the context of this page, what I'm doing is saying, I know there's a variable that exists somewhere, and I want to use it as the value of that text box. So I'll go from variable, and this is where that context becomes very important. Knowing where this page is being opened at is really important, because over here, this page is a child page of the root home page. But over here, page 2 is by itself. There is no home page, right? And so understanding that context becomes very important, because if I'm wanting to pull from a variable that's in the home page, I have to have the home page loaded. So I wouldn't want to do current page here because current page in this context is page 2 itself. Right, so the variable doesn't exist there. The variable exists on the root page in this context because the root page is the home page. And remember, we set that variable to the home page. I could also say get it from the home page because it is the home page. I could also say parent page in this context because it is the direct parent. The home page is the direct parent of this page because of the structure we put in place here, where we opened it into an element. So the direct parent of page 2 is that home page. So this context concept and the scoping concept is probably the most important thing to get through whenever you're trying to understand how to use variables. So for this purpose, I'm just going to use root page because I know that's where this is going to exist. And we'll put that value in there, my value in there. So basically, when we click this button, it's going to look in the root page and go, get the value from the root page variable called my value and set whatever's in it into this text box. So that's what this action is going to do when we click that button. So if I go over to my home page and I just click that button now, there's no variable set yet because we haven't run through any of this, right? We haven't typed anything in. We haven't clicked the button to set the variable. So if I do that, there's nothing in the value. So it just empties it out. But if I first type Mark in here and then hit set variable and then hit get variable and set into text, when I hit set variable, it set the root page variable. And then when I did the get variable and set it into text, it took that value and placed it into the element. So that's how you would use something. This is this concept of I've got a root page that's a home page. Maybe I'm processing some things on that page or somewhere else, and I set variables up into the root, and then I reuse those on different child pages throughout my app that I'm building. Right. So you'll use that quite a bit, especially if you're doing things like complex filters or getting APIs and things like that and pulling them in. Think of variables as basically temporary values that you're going to use for some purpose later on within the same app page. So I'm on this home page and all those variables are in the context of that. As soon as I refresh this page, so remember I do get variable and it sets what's in the root into here. But if I do refresh, that variable no longer exists. So if I go open page into container and then I click the get variable again, it's empty again. Right. So every time the user refreshes the page, all the variables get completely removed. So you'd either need to, if you want some variables there by default, you would need to do them in the page load, or you would need to like have the user interact like I did here with, if I did Drew here, set variable, and then get, then it'll go do it. So another key concept of variables is they do not persist across different sessions. So like if I open this into another tab, it's starting over. There are no variables here yet, right? If I refresh the page, there are no variables there yet. So that would basically mean that a variable is always temporary. Like think of it completely as temporary values to just be reused for other purposes. So before I go any further, in terms of like scoping and conceptually, where to put these things, are there any questions that you want to ask, or should I go over anything from the chat at all, Corey or Drew?
There's a question in the chat, but I mean, it's not, you might want to finish this first, it'll be a separate topic.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
I also have another question that got DM'd to me for Chris. So, but yeah, I think we can keep going and then
Cool.
Quick question.
Yeah.
If you were to run on page 2, the route version right now, it would not work, right? Because it wasn't set within the context of page 1.
Exactly. There's no variable there at all because we never even set it's for the same reason really as on refresh here. This page 2 is just looking for a root page variable called my value. So if it doesn't exist in any context, it doesn't have it, right? So over here, nothing is ever setting a variable called my value in the root. So basically it's never going to get it. Just like if I click here, same thing. If I go over here, refresh. Did I break something? Why did that go away? Oh, that's super weird.
Hack it.
What did I do here?
I don't know.
That doesn't
I
make
didn't
any sense.
notice anything.
Because I'm here.
It's something though. It's something.
Are you like in the middle of making something? I don't even remember
I
where
don't
you
think
left off
so.
on page 2, but yeah.
No, the only thing on there is this. It doesn't make any sense. Let's see if there's like a cache thing or what. That's super weird.
I like it.
Uh,
I like finding bugs, or like when stuff like this happens, because it's like, cool.
I've never even seen that error though.
We can fix it.
There's nothing running in here. Let me do this. I want to see something because there's nothing running. It shouldn't have any, like there's literally no actions to run here.
There, it's back.
Yeah, but it was from when I removed that. What? Okay, we're gonna go into the recording and we're gonna get that error and we're gonna show it to Darrell. Because that, I don't know. I got nothing.
That's
I've got
wild.
nothing. Yeah, that's really weird. But let's get seriously, Gore, let's go into the recording and get that error. I should have copied it before I resolved it without resolving it. So back to the question real quick. Yes, so because that context doesn't exist in terms of there's no variable in the root here, when I click this button, remember that action, all it's doing, if we look at what that action is doing, is it's looking in the root page for this variable called my value. And it's not going to exist there. So if you're wanting something to carry across tabs or across the user's use of different routes in the same session, that's where we're going to use cookies. So instead, if I were to set a cookie with that value, and then we put a button on page 2 to get the cookie, that will actually go across the tabs. So variables are scoped within the browser window that you're in. Refreshing kills them, going to other routes kills them. They just start over every time you load a page, every time you load a root page. Whereas cookies actually get stored inside the browser itself as something that persists across all the tabs. And the cookie is specific to the URL that you're in. So a cookie would not, like if you set a cookie and you're using your preview and then you publish to a test subdomain, when you go to the test subdomain, that cookie is not going to exist there yet. You'd have to do whatever the steps are that create that cookie in that subdomain for it to happen. So think of it like for this website, the specific subdomain.domain, this thing, when you set a cookie, that persists within that website until it's either destroyed or you can set a timeout limit on it so that it automatically destroys itself. But you can also go, just like empty it out. You can remove the value inside the cookie as well. So let's do the cookie one real quick, and then we'll do grids. So let's do another button here. So this one is going to be set cookie. And we'll go to events, do set cookie. I move the Zoom call. So set cookie instead of set variable. So the cookie name, oops, wrong thing. It was supposed to be my value. I forgot I copied that. So my value, we'll just use the same cookie name. Or we could call it my cookie, just so it's different. Let's do that. And then the cookie value, we're going to do the same thing we did for setting the variable. We're going to pull it from that text input. So it's the same concept. I'm basically setting a cookie called my cookie instead of setting a variable called my value, right? So when we click that, it's going to set the cookie. Now we need another button over here that takes the value inside of this cookie called my cookie and sets it into that text box. So if we do another button on here, another button. And that button will be get cookie set into text. So this is where there's one extra step you have to do, but let's just go ahead and create the flow, get cookie. So remember when we set the variable if we go look at that flow, we set the value directly, and then we use the value here to pull the variable directly. Well, in Builder right now, there is no type in here of from cookie. We are adding that because we really need it. It'd be much easier to just pull it directly from the cookie there. And then you just select a cookie name, and we'll track those cookie names just like we track variable names. When you set a cookie, we'll keep track of it. But for now, you first have to get the cookie, set that cookie into a variable, and then use that value to set it into the element. So what we're going to do is in the get cookie flow, we're going to have two actions. So one is the get cookie. And when you get a cookie, all you do is put the name, and it's going to go retrieve that cookie from the browser. And it's going to set the value, the contents of that cookie, into a variable, whatever you name it here. So that means we have to do two steps. We have to take it from here, and then we need that set element value action afterward to get the variable that this action set and set it into that element. So the way I'm going to do that, rather than adding it manually, I do this all the time. It just speeds me up. Rather than adding an action and searching for it, I already have one that does something very similar. So I'm just going to copy that, go back to my other flow, paste it, add a wait, make sure these are waiting. So that way this one waits until it actually has the value from the cookie. And then I'm changing my variable name to cookie value because that's what it's setting it into. So if we remember two steps here, go get the cookie value that was set in my cookie and set it as cookie value in a variable. And now this variable, notice that this doesn't have a context to it of current, root, parent, all those other things that we were looking at with the variables. When you see an action that has it like this, that means that it's always setting it into the current page. So if you're ever, when you go to retrieve that variable, you want to pull it from the current page. Now, if you remember the context of page 2, if I leave it as root page, this will work as long as you're in the URL route where page 2 is the root. But over here, it would not work because page 2 is not the root. So it'd be looking in the wrong spot. So this needs to be changed to current page. So basically get cookie is going to set that variable into the current page. And then you're going to retrieve it from the current page and set it into that text box. So if I go back over here, we'll type Cora in here and we'll set the cookie. Now there's also something you can do right now. You can check if you click on this little lock icon and go to cookies and open the full domain one. So this one, cookies and my cookie. So this is where we can see the content that was set in there. So you can see Cora is in this cookie called my cookie that was set whenever we did that. So if I change this, if I hit done, change this to Cora 2 and set it again, we can actually check the cookies that are in use by going here. My cookie, Cora 2 is now set. Okay, so anytime you want to see what those cookies are, you can see it this way. And in the last office hours, I went through using Xano backend authentication. So we authenticated with Xano, and then we took the token, the key that they provided us to use, and we set that into a cookie. And you can see it here. It's the same thing. So think of a cookie as a way to just, basically it's like a variable value, but you can use it all over the place. So I set the cookie, and I can use it in this context where I can set it into here because that went, got the cookie out of the value out of the cookie, set it into that variable. Then the second action took the variable and set it into this page. But what's great about using a cookie for this is if I go over here, completely different context, it's also going to work because I stored that value of Cora 2 not inside of a page variable, but inside of a cookie, which is like outside of all the pages and stored inside the browser itself. So using cookies is really useful if you want to keep a value across all the pages that are open in different tabs for the same user. It's a really nice way to make certain UXs consistent across when they open things. So like if you give a user an option to sort of like pop this out into a new window or into a new tab, if you've set some data into cookies, you can reuse that data in the popped out thing. But for the most part, almost all apps are going to end up being like a single page web app and for most things. And so you'll use variables a lot more, but sometimes you do need to use a cookie to like push that across all these different pages. All right, so I'll stop there before I go into grids and
Yeah.
answer any questions.
So Emmanuel is basically saying cookies are like a global variable.
Yeah, it's like well, yeah, I mean, you could almost call
It was
a
like
root
super
variable.
global.
Yeah.
Like global variables usually within the app, it works anywhere. This is like it works, outside. It works anywhere on the domain you set it on. So it's like a kind of like an extra global variable.
It almost depends on how you define global and how you define
Yeah.
app, right? So like app could be that my app persists across all these different tabs. So in that case, yeah, that's the global variable. But in the context of like a single page web app, it would actually, a cookie and a root page variable would act exactly the same, except you would have it persist after the user refreshes. So that's the other really valuable thing about cookies is I can refresh this home page and I don't have to reset Cora 2 in there. I can just open that page and click the button and the cookie still has that data of Cora 2. So
And that's per user session, like that's
per session.
that's on the browser. So it's like very specific to the user.
Yeah, it's private.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's secure and private too. That's the other nice thing about a cookie is you with a variable, if it's something that's like secure, where you're being security conscious over the value, if you set that into a variable, any JavaScript can get it. Whereas if you're in the, any JavaScript could get it either way, but it's just stored in memory different. Like the browser holds it differently in the memory, and the cookies are intentionally meant to not be accessible. Whereas the variable values that are just in there, that's just JavaScript memory that's accessible by a lot more things that the browser gives access to. So for security things, you want to put those in cookies. And one other thing that I didn't mention there on that set cookie action is this expiration time in days. So I set this to not expire. But if you have something that is like an authentication token or something along those lines that you're storing in a cookie, you really do want to put a certain amount of time for expiration on here. But you'll need to handle that if it's a value that you're reusing in other places, because if you need that value, then every time you use it, you need to check to make sure you've got it because it might have expired since the last time. So the user would need to like re-sign in or do whatever process they were doing to get that cookie set in the first place.
Okay, cool. So we do have some questions, not necessarily related. I just want to make sure we have
Cool.
time. It's 10:33 right now.
Yeah,
Do you want to go through variables inside grids and then we'll answer questions?
perfect. Yeah, and I'll go fairly quick on the grid variables. Let's make some data first.
And Mark, can I ask you something real quick?
Yeah.
Could you compare and contrast the local storage as opposed to the cookies, and what are the benefits and
Drew might actually be better at explaining that than I am. But we
Yeah.
don't have actions for local storage and we really need to make some. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Drew.
I'm gonna make those actions. They're very similar to the cookie actions, but I'm not an expert like security and all that stuff. Like I don't want to say anything wrong, but I actually personally use local storage to be a little more secure. Like local storage, you can't see it in the way that he was looking at the cookies in the browser. You can't see what's in local storage as easily. Like it's like a local database in the browser. And you can do more things. You can store different kinds of things. So it's like a little more versatile. So I've kind of like transitioned, or when I was doing a lot of code before I got into Bildr as much, I was doing a lot of local storage and almost no cookies, but they're essentially the same thing. I mean, they're like, I think that the cookies potentially may be less secure, but that's where I don't want to say the wrong thing. But I think that like a hacker or like someone who knew what they were doing could more easily get access to a cookie than the local storage.
Do you agree, John? Do you know about that?
I just asked because I've used them before in like some Chrome plugins and stuff, using local storage to store like inputs and entries and stuff like that. And then it persists in the browser. So you don't have to, with the cookies, it stores an actual token, right? And that token is, like you said, it's viewable. I don't know the security implications, but I definitely think it's definitely an alternative, right, that you can use potentially.
Yeah. I almost think local storage is more modern, but I think really they just have different uses. But I feel like local storage is like a more versatile and almost like a better solution to use.
It definitely allows you to have more data, right? So like you can't really store very much data in a cookie. Like if you're looking to store records of data or something, I would not do that in a cookie. Cookies are really meant for like this little string of data, maybe a token or something like that, that needs to persist across the session. But if you're wanting to like hold all your data local, definitely use local data storage. I don't know what the limits are in cookies, but it's not like a lot. You know, I don't think it's something you could really realistically use for data.
Cool. If I come across any articles or something like that, I'll look it up and I can always share in the Discord.
So I've got a set of grid rows here now. I just manually did it. I created 3 records with just like 1, 2, and 3 on them. And then I have this setting with the collection list to get all that data and put it into the grid. So now when I refresh my homepage, I have 3 page 2s inside of there. So what's interesting about the way that this is done is if I put Cora 1 in here and set the variable, I can go to each of these pages and it will get the variable out of the root, because remember that's referencing the root page and putting it in there. So all 3 of those page instances can reference that root page and set the variable. And in the same way, I can go, you know, we'll call it Cora cookie and set cookie. And I can go into these all, and they'll all go to that root, to the cookie and pull it and set the value. So what's nice about using these root page variables or cookies, they're both global in a sense. And so you can reuse them on multiple pages being displayed inside of your UI and use them as necessary in different contexts across those pages. So even though these are technically the same page, there's 3 instances of that page that I'm viewing, and I can use those root variables inside of those pages all the time as I need to. So in terms of like using them across the rows, that's the primary use in terms of like from root page. Now, one thing to note is that each row automatically gets a set of variables applied inside of it whenever the pages are rendered. So each row is set with data in this instance. So if I inspect this, I can actually see it here. I think we did this in another session too, where if I go into here and go to an element that's actually on the page, like this button, I'm going to right click on it and set store as global variable. Inside of here, I don't like this console view, I like to go here. Inside of here, I can type this one, browobject.browform._vars, and this will actually give me the variables that are local to that specific page inside of there. And so you can see that it's got that cookie value because that action set it locally. You could see the different column IDs, like this is ZKXQ. If we go back into the data table, when we look at this test 1, remember it had a value of 1. This is that ZKXQJ. This is that field value. So whenever the data got set into that grid row, into the grid, each field of data gets represented locally inside of that row as a variable, which means you can actually reference those things locally with the context of that. So for instance, I could go create a set element value action that sets the value from this variable. And that's going to do the same thing as if I did set the value from the current record field value. That'll actually go do the same thing because those are the same. It's actually drawing from the same place. And then the other thing here is the ID. So this is the ID that got set with that, which I do use a good bit for different purposes where I'm like wanting to find some records related to this instance or whatever it is. So I'll use that to set it. So the other thing about grid row variables, the only other concept I wanted to pull out is that when you set data into it, it automatically has those variables as local reference. And that's not too important in terms of like Bildr collections because we actually handle it for you. You can use current record field value to access that stuff automatically. You don't have to know the field name IDs and all that stuff. But if you're using external data, it becomes important because in here, inside of this row, this grid row, I can go set the data binding for it to come from a variable in that local row. So for instance, if you go pull Xano data and you set it into this grid, each field name is going to exist as a variable in every row. So you could just type in, field 1, whatever the name of the field is, and it's going to automatically do that binding from over there. And that's because of that context of when we set the data into the grid, we automatically build out these variables. And I would say that's probably all there's more, but I think that's probably enough in terms of like high level conceptual stuff to get through most of variables and how to use them.